So good afternoon and welcome to the William G. McGowan Theater here at the National Archives. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and I'm pleased that you could join us today, whether you're here in person or viewing us on our YouTube station, and a special welcome to our friends at C-SPAN. What better place is there to talk about Stephen Puljo's new book, American Treasures, The Secret Efforts to Save the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Gettysburg Address. The National Archives is full of treasures. Some are undiscovered, some are quite famous. With the most famous ones, such as those named in the book's title, we often assume that they were always here and were destined to be. How they came about and how they survived to our day is not always a straight path, however. Before we get to that fascinating story, though, I'd like to let you know about two other programs coming up this month. On Thursday, October 13th at noon, we'll screen a new historical documentary film, The Year of the Tiger, JFK 1962, which features archival images, film footage, and audio recordings from the National Archives and other sources to chronicle the October 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. The film's director, Joe Luby, will be here to discuss the film and answer questions. And on Wednesday, October 19th at 7 p.m., Alelia Bundles, journalist, author, and chair of the National Archives Foundation, will moderate a panel discussion on revolutionary movements, then and now, Black Power and Black Lives Matter. The program is presented by the National Archives African American Employee Affinity Group, Say It Loud, in commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Black Power movement. To learn more about these and all of our public programs and exhibits, consult our monthly calendar of events in print or online at archives.gov. There are copies in the lobby as well as a sign-up sheet where you can receive it by regular mail or email. And you'll also find brochures about other National Archives activities. Earlier I said that we are in a most appropriate place to talk about Stephen Puljo's American Treasures. Just above us in the rotunda are two of the documents he writes about, the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution. When this building was constructed in the 1930s, the rotunda was designed to display those two plus the Bill of Rights. When the National Archives building opened to the public in 1936, only the Bill of Rights occupied its display case. We had to wait until 1952 to bring all three founding documents together. And the story of how the Declaration and Constitution came to the National Archives is the one we never tire of hearing. Now I'd like to introduce Jesse Kratz, the historian of the National Archives. Jesse became the first of our agency's historian in 2013. She was previously with the Center for Legislative Archives here at the National Archives and has been with the agency since 1999. Please welcome Jesse Kratz.
Thank you, David. I'm very happy that Steve could be with us today during American Archives Month to talk about his new book, American Treasures. His work demonstrates not only the importance of the records created by other federal agencies, but also the importance of the records that we at the National Archives have created ourselves. In writing his book, Steve consulted several different sets of records, but the one that is nearest and dearest to my heart is the records of the National Archives. These records help tell our story as an institution, how we came to be, who we were, and how we got here. The documents trace our growth and development and range from the correspondence of the first archivist of the United States, R.D.W. Connor, to the 53 gigabytes of digital photos of our more recent activities that we just transferred into the collection. Our records also provided the background Steve needed to tell the story of how the Declaration of Independence and Constitution came here from the Library of Congress. It was a pleasure to work with Steve, and it's a pleasure and an honor to introduce him now. Steve Puljo is a historian, a professor, a public speaker, and a prolific author. The caning, the assault that drove America to civil war, and Dark Tide, the Great Boston Molasses Flood of 1919, are just two of his many publications. Puljo holds a master's degree in history and teaches the subject at Suffolk University in Boston. He is an award-winning reporter and a contributor to American History Magazine and the Boston Globe. You can read more about his new book in the fall issue of Prologue, the magazine of the National Archives. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Stephen Puglia.
Thanks, Jesse. Thank you, Jesse. Thank you, David. And welcome to you all today. I just need you to say this. David and Jesse have been terrific supporters of me and encouragers of me on this book. If the rest of the archive staff is as wonderful as them, I can tell you the Declaration, the Constitution, and Bill of Rights are in very, very good hands. You should all feel good about that. I want to thank you folks for being here today. Are there visitors here, people from outside of the Washington area? How many do we have? Okay, good, a good representation of that. Great. I want you to know I'm from the Boston area. So for me to speak in this esteemed theater in this fabulous building is like somebody taking batting practice or playing at Fenway Park. It's a real shrine. We were eliminated last night, the Sox, some of you may know. But for me, this is just a fabulous, fabulous place to be, and I'm thrilled to be here. And for you folks who could be doing many, many other things in this great city, hundreds and hundreds of other things, I do appreciate you being here. It's wonderful. This book, for me, has been a real labor of love. It is, on one level, the story of how the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Gettysburg Address were moved out of Washington by the Library of Congress, where they were at the time, in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. And they were moved for safety reasons, for fear of sabotage, of bombs, etc., destroying our very priceless documents. And those three documents, along with a few others that were moved to Fort Knox, Kentucky, for safekeeping, they began what would become the largest relocation of American documents in history for safekeeping. Thousands of others would get moved to other locations during the Second World War for safekeeping. So that's one thread, one narrative thread that American Treasures works on. But I realized as I was doing the research that in order to really understand the why are these documents so precious? Why are these documents so priceless? Why did we go out of our way to save them? Why did President Roosevelt feel such a strong connection to these documents that he felt he was a steward to these documents? Why did Librarian of Congress Archibald MacLeish feel the same way? Why did the Secret Service, led by Harry Neal, the lead agent in charge of helping to relocate these documents, why did they feel so strongly about it? I had to go back and I had to talk about the creation of these documents, the ideas contained in them, and the many steps that were taken throughout our history to protect these documents and preserve them. So in this book, I take you back to 1776, to the creation of the Declaration of Independence, that late spring, early summer time, including probably the four most remarkable days in all of American history, July 1 through 4. Where independence is debated, voted on July 2nd, not July 4th, but July 2nd. John Adams of Massachusetts said that July 2nd would forever be remembered as an epic day with brilliant bonfires, illumination, bands, and celebrations. So he was just 2 days off. But that was July 2nd. July 3rd, when Jefferson's Declaration is debated, and July 4th, when it's adopted. So I take you back there and then bring you back to the Second World War years. I take you back to 1787 in Philadelphia, that real steamy, hot summer, when the Constitution was debated and ratified, or debated and adopted, ratified a little later, where the principles of the Declaration of Independence are codified into law, laws that we still use today, a document that is so meaningful today. I take you back to 1814, when the British literally invaded and burned Washington. They burned the president's house, they burned the Capitol, they burned other buildings. And a clerk by the name of Stephen Pleasanton, State Department clerk, has the presence of mind to take the original Declaration and the original Constitution, stuff them in linen sacks, throw them in the back of a wagon, and have them taken out to Virginia for safekeeping. And he does it in defiance of the Secretary of War, who at the time says, the British aren't coming to Washington. They're not coming. They have no interest in Washington. They're only going to Baltimore. Pleasanton says, no, I don't think so. Realizes the impact to the nation's psyche, very young nation at the time. And he moves those documents out of there. At the same time, almost the same time, Dolly Madison is at the White House until the very last second. Her husband, James, is in the field with his troops. Dolly's at the White House until the last second, and she saves many, many critical documents, including her husband's notes of the Constitutional Convention of 1787, which almost no American even knew existed at the time. And for me, doing the research, I really felt that connection as I was going through Madison's papers and his notes from the convention, saying to myself, I would not be able to do this if not for Dolly's heroics in 1814. I take you back to 1823, when a Washington, D.C. engraver by the name of William Stone creates the first exact replica of the Declaration of Independence. An exact facsimile. Lots of patriotic fervor around this time after the War of 1812. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams says, I want you to create something that is precisely a replica of the engrossed Declaration. What do we mean by engrossed? It's the document you'll see in the rotunda if you haven't already. The beautifully calligraphy document with flourishes and curlicues and slashes and underlines and the signatures underneath of the delegates. Lots of debate going into 1823 about who had created a replica. There had been other kind of copies made, none exactly like the original engrossed document. William Stone does that. It takes him 3 years, unveils it in 1923 on the 4th of July. And it's that replica that essentially becomes the starting point for the millions and millions of copies of the Declaration of Independence that you might have in government buildings, that you might have in schools, that you can pick up in the archives store, if you'd like, or that you might have hanging in your home, like my parents did. We sold my parents' home just a couple of years ago, and one of the last things I took off the wall down in our little basement was a replica copy of the Declaration of Independence that my folks had purchased during the American Bicentennial in 1976. That gets unveiled in 1823. I take you back to July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the signing of the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. America's golden jubilee. And again, this great rebirth of patriotism to celebrate the 50th anniversary. But July 4th of 1826 gets elevated to a whole new level when two of our greatest founders, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, die on the exact same day. Raises the gravitas of July 4th to an almost religious kind of holiday. The level that we kind of celebrate July 4th today is almost a direct result of Adams and Jefferson's deaths on July 4th of 1826. And that wasn't the only July 4th. On July 4th, 1831, just 5 years later, Revolutionary War hero and former President James Monroe dies on July 4th. Further kind of elevating the 4th of July. So you'll learn a little bit about that. I take you back to 1863, when President Abraham Lincoln is dedicating a cemetery at a small crossroads town in central Pennsylvania and delivers his masterful 2.5-minute speech. My presentation to you today will be 20 times longer than the Gettysburg Address. And I'm sorry to say, nowhere near as memorable. Hope you enjoy it, but nowhere near as memorable. He forever broadens the meaning of all men are created equal in that speech, and we'll talk a little bit about that. I take you back to 1876, America's centennial celebration in Philadelphia, where the original engrossed Declaration of Independence is kind of trotted out for display and proclamation. And there's real concern about the physical deterioration of that document. Maybe for the first time. There'd been some mutterings about it down through the years. But on the 100th anniversary, some real concerns about the fading, the signatures fading. We'll talk a little bit about that. Into the 20th century, there's the movement of the documents from the State Department to the Library of Congress. And then those World War II years that we'll talk about. And then the date that David alluded to in 1952, when the original Declaration and the original Constitution get transferred from the Library of Congress to the National Archives. One of the most, I would say maybe the most important day in the history of this building, for sure, but quite a day. So you'll go back and forth like that. Because when you think about it, folks, the history of these documents really is the history of our country. The parchments themselves, yes, but the ideas contained in them. I had a very perceptive editor say to me once, America has no crown jewels, but if she did, it would be these documents. I don't think there's any question about it. Ours is the first constitutional republic that can trace its very founding back to a single document. That's the Declaration of Independence. And I would argue this. I would argue that the principles that our country and our government rest on, the aspirations of our country, because we don't always get it right, but I think we aspire to, can really be traced back to really a single paragraph. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are, what are they? Yeah, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which we all know. And maybe the lesser known part of that paragraph, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving, wait for it, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. That's Jefferson's iconic second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. And as I said, our concepts of freedom, of liberty, of equality rest on that second paragraph. And think about when he does this, lest you take that for granted, folks. Think about when he does this in 1776. This is an era of warlords, dictators, and monarchs. That's what we're talking about. Monarchs who ruled by fiat, and everyone else just about did as they were told. This notion of equality, of governments deriving their power from the people, a completely foreign concept, a revolutionary, dare I say it, concept in 1776. 11 years later, in 1787, Gouverneur Morris writes his eloquent preamble to the Constitution. That's his unusual first name. By the way, Gouverneur, it's not Governor Morris of Pennsylvania. It's Gouverneur Morris. Abigail Adams, who used to write phonetically, does write it that way, and I think that's the best that we have to pronounce his name. When he writes, "We the people of the United States," again, he is representing the codification of those principles that were in the Declaration. And when he says we need to secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity in that preamble, that's what he's talking about for the current generation and for future generations. And later on, during the discussion of the presidency, during the Constitution Convention, the Federal Convention in 1787, lots of talk about how much power the president was going to have. And it was Morris who says during the discussion, this chief executive is not going to be the king in this new government. He will be more like the prime minister. The people are the king. Again, unheard of in 1787. And later on, when Abraham Lincoln stands before that gathering at Gettysburg and says, these men have died so that a nation can live. And when he implores the audience to make sure that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation shall have a new birth of freedom, and the government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. What is he saying? Abraham Lincoln, a great admirer of the founders and a great admirer of the Declaration and the Constitution, is saying this. He knows that the issue of slavery, the scourge of slavery, was the big omission from these documents. And yet what he says is, those documents hold the key for this nation to bind its wounds. Now, we don't need to scrap the Declaration of Independence. We just need to broaden the interpretation of all men are created equal. We don't need to tear up the Constitution, because the framers have given us the power to what? Amend the Constitution. And so that's a very, very important point. Lincoln, who said back in 1861, as early as 1861, said that his favorite principle in the Declaration is that everyone had an equal chance. And in a very eerie, kind of prophetic statement says, and rather than surrender that principle, I would rather be assassinated on the spot. He says in 1861. Kind of chilling when you read it. But that's how much he believed in these documents. Very, very important. And these documents are important for other reasons too. When you think about the steps that were taken in the Second World War to protect them, one of the big reasons is this. These documents were not predestined. They were not foregone conclusions. They were extremely hard to come by. In 1776, remember, what did we have at that time? Your classic, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. 1/3 of the people in general were Tories, loyal to the crown. 1/3 of the people wanted revolution and splitting from the crown. And in this election year, I think appropriately, 1/3 were undecideds, right? They were undecideds. They weren't really polled, but they were undecideds. And the delegates, by the way, certainly weren't all in agreement. John Dickinson of Pennsylvania says, to separate right now from Britain would be like tearing down our house without having another place to live and asking our neighbor to take us in. It would be like setting sail in a skiff made of paper. Terrible idea. Let's wait, he says. Let's wait till Europe kind of recognizes us. Let's wait till the time is right. But finally, when the delegates approve independence on July 2nd, when the Declaration is adopted on July 4th, there would be no more waiting. And after it's engrossed, it takes a couple of weeks for the document to be beautifully engrossed by engraver and engrosser Timothy Matlock. The delegates step up and sign this document, the most of them on August 2nd of 1776. And they realize as they are doing so the solemnity of the moment. They are doing so under great risk. Colonies are at war. If they lose the war, it's likely that these signers are going to be killed. Found guilty of treason for sure, no question about it. But even during the war, concerns that their families would be harmed, their farms would be harmed, they would be harmed once the signers' names got out into the general public. But they step up and they do it. My favorite example, or my favorite quote, is as the signing is taking place on August 2nd, 69-year-old Rhode Island delegate Stephen Hopkins. He had a little bit of Parkinson's disease, a little palsy. When he signed, he had a shaky signature. You can see it in on the Declaration. Hard to see now, but look at one of your replicas and you can see it. But as he stepped up, he said, "My hand trembles, but my heart does not." Very kind of big moment. And during the Constitution, are you kidding me? The convention almost falls apart. There's a huge battle between the large state delegates, defined then Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Virginia, New York, and the small state delegates, defined then New Jersey, Maryland, Delaware, Connecticut, etc. What was the issue over? The issue was over how would these states be represented in Congress. Large state guys, Madison, Hamilton, Washington, said all of the representation should be done according to population, proportional representation. Small states said, that is not going to work for us. The power of the states will be diluted. William Paterson of New Jersey says, when the large state folks put forth their plan for proportional representation, New Jersey will never agree to this plan. She would be swallowed up. Gunning Bedford of Delaware says to the large state folks, to Madison and the rest, "I do not, gentlemen, trust you." He did call them gentlemen. "I do not trust you." Roger Sherman of Connecticut says, just before the 4th of July of 1787, "We are now at a full stop. We're not going to get this thing done." Delegates break for the 4th of July, the 11th 4th of July, if you will, 1787. In Philadelphia, there's celebrations. They kind of take stock of what they're doing, what they're here to do. And they come back with this resolve to get something done, to make some sort of a compromise to get a new constitution. And they do on July 16th of 1787, the most important day, I would say, during the whole Constitutional Convention, the Federal Convention, when they come back with a grand compromise. And you know it well. What is it? In the lower house of Congress, well, that representation will be determined by population. And in the upper house, we're going to call that the Senate, folks. Each state would be equally represented. They'd each get 2. That was the deal. Neither side was very happy with this deal. The large state folks, I would say, were close to apoplectic. But they put it together to give us the Constitution that we have today. Not a foregone conclusion by any stretch of the imagination. And even the Gettysburg Address in November of 1863. First of all, Lincoln almost doesn't go to Gettysburg. He's an afterthought. He's invited to say a few remarks. He's not the guest speaker. That's Edward Everett of Massachusetts, who, by the way, delivers a 2-hour oratory at Gettysburg. 2 hours long. They say, Lincoln, would you like to come? You're the president. Maybe say a few words. Lincoln debates for a little while. Well, sounds like a good idea. What do you think, Stanton? Stanton says, I don't know. What's the big deal? All right, we're going. They go. He delivers his speech. It lives forever and will live forever. But he almost doesn't go. And by the way, the Union still has to win the war. Now, by November of '63, things have changed dramatically. The tide has changed in their favor. Victories at Gettysburg, victories at Vicksburg, etc. But there's 17 months of really hard fighting ahead. Nobody knows that in November of 1863. So think about that when you think about these documents. On the two ends, you have the Declaration and the Gettysburg Address, where wars have to be won for the documents to have any teeth whatsoever. Otherwise, they're just paper, parchment, in the case of the Declaration. And in the middle, you have the Constitution, where a massive compromise that almost nobody likes has to happen for the Constitution to be put into place. That's one of the reasons Roosevelt and McLeish and Harry Neal of the Secret Service wanted to preserve these documents. And I think there's another really important one. When you think about these documents, when you go view these documents in the rotunda, think about this. These documents are artifacts, to be sure. They're artifacts, no question about it. They're in protective cases. They're protected from humidity, from dust, from mites, you name it. Computerized systems can tell you inch by inch whether these documents are deteriorating. Great conservators work here to keep those documents in the best shape possible. So they're certainly artifacts. But what else are they? They're symbols. Very, very important symbols. Again, go to the rotunda. It's a shrine. There's no question about it. The lights are kind of low. There's guards there. It tends to be quiet. Even when there's kids in there, it's quiet. And I know of what I speak. I am the husband of the principal of a pre-K to 8 school. We take 8th graders down here every year. When you're the husband of the principal, you are a chaperone, by the way. You will be a chaperone, and I love it. But we take our kids down there. It's quiet. The kids are quiet. They're looking at it. They're looking at these documents. They don't quite maybe understand the significance. I try my best not to be insufferable and tell them about it while I'm there. Key word is try. Last year when we were here, I was telling the kids a little bit about the Declaration, and I heard another group, kids in another group say, hey, that guy knows what he's talking about. So it was pretty interesting. But they're symbols, right? When they were displayed in the centennial of 1876, the Declaration is a symbol. So they're artifacts and they're symbols, and they're one other thing, right? They are our daily blueprint for how we govern, how we determine our laws, almost how our culture operates. So this notion of all men are created equal, this broadened all people are created equal notion, this notion of life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, it is the underlying thing we think about as we are creating laws, as we are instituting rules, as we are doing things in our daily culture. And again, it doesn't mean we're perfect at it, but that's always part of the discussion. And the Constitution is part of our daily lives. Every time a newscaster says, does Congress have enough votes to override a presidential veto? Who will control the Senate in the next election? Will the Supreme Court find this law constitutional or unconstitutional? every single day, every single time you hear that, it's that Constitution, part of our daily lives and our daily governance. So think about that. These documents, they're artifacts. These documents, they're symbols. These documents are day-to-day blueprints by which we operate. They're all of those gathered into one. So I was thinking about that during my research, and guess what? Roosevelt and McLeish and Harry Neal were thinking about that during the Second World War. I want you to think about this. After Pearl Harbor is attacked on December 7th of 1941, Washington goes into lockdown. Gun emplacements on the roofs, sentries at the War Department. The White House goes dark right around December 9th. There's debate on whether to paint the White House black. They don't, but they do paint windows black. Bulletproof glass is installed at the Oval Office. Secret Service gives gas masks to the White House staff. FDR kept his on his wheelchair arm. Secret Service builds a 750-foot zigzag tunnel that links the White House with the Treasury Department in case FDR and his staff needed to get over there for safety. Food down there, clothing down there, toilet facilities, office space down there. FDR said to Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, "Henry, I'm not going down there unless I can play poker with all the gold in your vaults." Never does go down there, but that tunnel, photos of that tunnel, still classified. You can't get them from the Secret Service archives. Believe me, I tried. Got a very nice note back to say, can't do it. But Washington is in lockdown. There is real fear of German bombers, real fear of sabotage during this period. There's even talk, folks, about rerouting the flow of the Potomac and Anacostia rivers. Why is that? Because at the confluence of those rivers, pilots could get a fix on the White House, about a mile behind that, but right in line. So there's even talk about that. FDR says during a press conference in February of 1942, during a press conference, the Germans can probably come in and bomb New York City or Washington, D.C. tonight. And under certain circumstances, he doesn't elaborate on those, but under certain circumstances, they might even be able to reach Detroit and bomb it tonight. Wow, pretty stunning. What FDR knew, and only some people along the coast of the United States knew, but certainly not all Americans knew, is that the other thing that was going on is that German U-boats were sinking American merchant ships up and down the East Coast with impunity. They sink about 600 of them from January to August of 1942. 600 of them. Cape Cod near me, Cape May, Cape Hatteras, killing grounds for U-boats. Virginia Beach, the Outer Banks, Jacksonville, killing grounds for U-boats. There is palpable fear. Palpable fear. And one of the great fears, and FDR feels himself a tremendous steward of these documents, one of the great fears is that these documents would be destroyed by bombs or by sabotage. And the hit to the national psyche would be devastating. Devastating. So we need to get those documents out of Washington. Now, plans had begun about a year earlier, even more than a year earlier. In the fall of 1940, Roosevelt and McLeish huddle. They see what's happening in England. The British lose thousands of documents when libraries are hit. During the Battle of Britain, during the Blitz, firebombings, incinerate these documents. The Germans are destroying millions of documents, books, manuscripts, mostly by Jewish writers, but others too in archives. So that's when the planning begins. Archibald MacLeish, Librarian of Congress, says to his staff, I want you to put together what we have that is utterly irreplaceable and unique. And then we're going to triage them. Level 1, level 2, all the way down to level 6. Level 6, still very important documents, but that's how we're going to do it. His staff does do that. And in the spring of 41, 7 months or so before Pearl Harbor, about 700 Library of Congress volunteers spend about 10,000 hours assessing, cataloging, and packing critical documents. 5,000 boxes of documents. The President's Papers, Washington's diaries, amazing numbers of documents, the notes of the Continental Congress, the Constitutional Convention notes that I mentioned that Dolly Madison rescued. Samuel Morse's first telegraph message, what hath God wrought? Letter from Queen Victoria to Mary Todd Lincoln after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, her condolence letter, where Queen Victoria says how much she feels for Mary Lincoln because she has barely gotten over the death of Prince Albert just a few months earlier. So this incredible collection of Americana, of American democracy, gets packed up in the spring. And when America finally goes to war after Pearl Harbor, the ball starts to roll to get these out of Washington. It starts on December 26th, 1941, the day after America's Pearl Harbor Christmas. Very eerie Christmas for Americans. Many have already, sons, uncles, brothers, daughters, have volunteered. Many Americans are wondering whether their family members would be there the next Christmas. So it's a very kind of eerie Christmas. The day after that, on December 26th, the Library of Congress and the Secret Service pack up the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Gettysburg Address, and a few other documents, a few other what they call first-tier documents. The Articles of Confederation, the Gutenberg Bible, Lincoln's second inaugural address, and one other non-American document, the Magna Carta from 1215, which is in the United States because it was on display at the 1939 New York City World's Fair. And when war breaks out in Europe, the Brits ask us to hold onto it for safekeeping. That's the other document that gets packed up. Archibald MacLeish made this joke that he thought Jefferson would find it kind of interesting and ironic that the Magna Carta was right next to the Declaration of Independence. And the Secret Service transports it from the Library of Congress to Union Station, puts it on a train under heavy guard in complete secrecy, and the train rumbles out to Louisville, Kentucky, where the documents are put in to the gold bullion depository at Fort Knox. Now, MacLeish had asked Morgenthau for room at Fort Knox at the gold bullion depository. He wanted some space to put a lot more. Morgenthau says, because there's tons of gold here, right? Already, Morgenthau says you can have about 60 cubic feet. It's about the size of a freezer, folks. I mean, do your math. 60 cubic feet, not much. So MacLeish has to make do with Fort Knox. But then the question becomes, where do we take the rest of these incredibly important documents? Library of staffers go on a road trip because here's what they're looking for. They're looking for places that are pretty far inland, or at least maybe 50 to 100 miles inland. They're looking for places that maybe have mountains around them that bombers can't get to. They're looking for places that are waterproof, fireproof, to the best possible ability, humidity-proof. So they go on these sojourn looking all around, where can we put these documents? And they end up with college repositories. The University of Virginia in Charlottesville, Washington and Lee in Lexington, VMI, Virginia Military Institute, in Lexington. But then they realize they still don't have enough space. So they pick Denison University in Granville, Ohio, about 400 miles from Washington, from right here. Later on, they realize that VMI has some humidity. They have to get them out of there, and they take them all to Denison. So the University of Virginia, Washington, Lee, and Denison become the repository for these documents. They looked at many places, over 60 places. Bowling Green, Kentucky had termites, couldn't put them there. Roanoke College had a fireproof basement, but it was near a swimming pool. Too much humidity, couldn't put them there. So that's the kind of thing that went in to the decision of where to put them. This is all done in complete secrecy, folks. This massive relocation. Library of Congress does this, but they're not the only people that do it. The National Gallery of Art, right near us. Am I pointing in the right direction? I'm not sure. National Gallery of Art relocates some of its most valuable paintings, Goya's, Rembrandt's, Raphael's, Botticelli's, to the Biltmore House in North Carolina. Has humidity controls. Libraries around the country do these kinds of moves. New York Public Library looks for caves. That was one of the things McLeish looked at too, but then there was some real concerns because caves have leakage. Caves have water problems. Caves have back entrances sometimes. So some of the New York Public Library documents get moved to bank vaults in the city and to Saratoga. So all of that happens during this period of time. These documents, these critical documents, the Declaration, the Constitution, the Gettysburg Address, they remain in Fort Knox, along with these 5,000 other boxes, until September of 1944. 3 months or so after D-Day, Allies are moving to Berlin from the west. The Russians are coming from the east. Not too much concern about an attack on the U.S. mainland at that point. Military intelligence, McLeish says it's time to move these documents and bring them east over the Alleghenies and the Blue Ridge and bring them home. And that's what happens. By the way, there was one exception prior to this that's so important. That took place on April 13th, 1943, the 200th anniversary of Thomas Jefferson's birth, during the dedication of the Jefferson Memorial in the Tidal Basin. April of 1943, FDR is really concerned about American morale. Been at war for 16, 17 months. It's a slog in April of 43. He thinks the dedication of the Jefferson Memorial and the display of the original Declaration of Independence will really help boost American spirits. And so the document is taken out of Fort Knox. Nobody knows where it came from. And put on display at the Jefferson Memorial for 1 week under 24-hour Marine Guard. Thousands of Americans come to see it. There's that symbol again. It's that symbol. And then it goes back to Fort Knox. One other point. One other part of this story I need to tell you before I get to your questions. And that is in 1952. December 13th, 1952, huge day. Huge parade down Pennsylvania Avenue, an avenue that's seen many parades. Military bands, military vehicles, military personnel accompanying the original Declaration and the original Constitution from the Library of Congress to here, National Archives. After many years of wrangling and infighting and some turf battles between the Library of Congress and the National Archives, decision finally gets made. President Truman driving it, with the Librarian of Congress and National Archivist at the time, Luther Evans and Wayne Grover, getting together to make it happen. But these documents need to be put on display for all Americans to see. And 2 days later, on December 15th, 1952, Bill of Rights Day, President Harry Truman presides over the ceremony, the enshrinement. Great word, right? The enshrinement ceremony here at the National Archives. One of Truman's last official acts as president. Ike had just been elected in '52, November. So Truman's in his lame duck phase. But this was an important moment for him because he loved these documents too. He knew the value of these documents. And he says to the assembled crowd here that if these documents are simply enshrined in these cases, the ideas contained in them will die. That in order for them to live on, and for the ideas embodied in them to live on, they must be enshrined, quote, in our hearts and minds. I think intrinsically, inherently, most Americans know this. I think the 1 million people that file through that rotunda every year know it. They may not express it in those words, but I think they know it just like Adams and Jefferson and Dolly Madison knew it, just like Stephen Pleasanton knew it, just like Abraham Lincoln knew it, just like FDR and McLeish and Harry Neal knew it. For 240 years, this is the 240th anniversary, folks, 240 years, these documents and the ideas contained in them have been protected and preserved by others. Harry Truman said to this crowd, that needs to continue to happen with this generation and future generations. That would be us. Let us hope we get it right. Thank you very much. I would love to take questions, guys. I have to just tell you. Oh, goodness. Hold on. Is he okay? He's okay. You okay? Yep. Okay. Yeah. He's good. Yet, this gentleman was excited to ask a question. Yes, sir.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. You spoke in a very lofty manner. My question is very practical.
Sure.
Lee's resolution on the 2nd, Jefferson's declaration on the 4th, was there a vote on each?
So Lee's resolution is on June 7th.
July 2nd, I'm sorry, July 2nd.
Yeah, so you know he makes the
yeah,
resolution
right.
3 weeks earlier. The delegates basically say, you know what, let's go home and see what our folks in our home colonies want to do. This is a big vote. So then they come back, and that vote is taken on July 2nd, yes. So on July 1st, there's a little bit of concern because at that point only 9 of the colonies have said yes. A lot of jockeying goes on. I talk about it in the book. A lot of jockeying goes on the night of July 1st into the morning of July 2nd, and yes, there's a vote on July 2nd. And then the adoption of the Declaration of Independence does happen on July 4th. Yes, separate vote. Is that your question?
Is there a vote on the 4th?
There's a vote on the 4th, yes. So it's a separate, completely separate thing.
So I know on the 2nd it's 12-zip with 1 abstention.
So you know New York was
Yeah.
the abstention.
Do you know what the vote is on the 4th?
Same, because New York's,
So
New York
same
does-
vote.
Yeah, so the Continental Congress doesn't get the okay from New York until about July 9th. I think it's July 9th, the legislature says yes. They kind of find out around July 14th, 15th. And that's what triggers the engrossing decision. And that's why it says the unanimous declaration, because New York decides that.
So 2 votes.
Yeah.
I want to affirm one of the statements you made. I'm
Yeah.
a volunteer, and I work up in the rotunda some of the time. I swear sometimes people are having what I call a mystical experience
Yeah, I think
as
that's
they
right.
stand there. It's unbelievable. I feel like we're...
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I've been there several times, and I totally agree with you. Yeah, thank you. Yes, sir.
A couple of questions. Number one, what was the deciding factor that Truman used to decide the documents would be here rather than the Library of Congress? Number two, I was struck by the idea that FDR had a tunnel built between the White House and the Treasury Department as a last bastion, because that's exactly what Lincoln did in spring of 1861, when there were no federal troops, and he determined they were going to hide out in the Treasury Department and use that as the last citadel if necessary. Were they aware of that precedent?
Right. So I'll answer the first question. This decision to move the documents was one that was happening for maybe close to 20 years. So when this archive is first built, that's one of the reasons why. It's Hoover who kind of says, let's move these documents. But there's lots of resistance by the Library of Congress. Let's face it, 2 of its most prestigious documents ever are there, and there's a lot of foot dragging, there's a lot of turf fighting. That happens occasionally in Washington. I don't know if you knew that. So there is a little bit of that resistance that happens. And then World War II kind of intercedes, and they're moved to Fort Knox. But then there's, in 1946, 47, and so from about 47 to 49, the Freedom Train makes its way around the United States. It has with it about 125 precious documents, not the Declaration and not the Constitution, which I consider almost too valuable, but the Bill of Rights and many other documents. The Freedom Train goes to 48 states. It's the only train that's gone to all 48 states. Millions of people view these documents that are under Marine Guard. There's kind of this resurgence in this interest in documents and kind of our history through that way. And so Luther Evans and Wayne Grover, at the time that's the Librarian of Congress and the National Archivist, kind of have this series of meetings where they talk about, we need to move these, is it time to move these? Congress has said we should move it. That's been that kind of a thing, that kind of an evolution. And they finally have lunch at the Cosmos Club, not too far from here. They finally have lunch and reach that agreement. And there are people at the Library of Congress who are furious with Luther Evans, furious, who say we will never again attain the prestige that we've had. They were wrong about that, right? The Library of Congress is maybe just as, wait, could I say that? Maybe just as prestigious as here. But there was really concern about that. To your question about Lincoln and the tunnel, there's no discussion in the documentation I see that alludes to the Civil War. Would Roosevelt have been aware of it? Yeah, sure. Would Henry Morgenthau have been aware of it in the Secret Service? Probably, yeah. But nothing that I can really definitively say to your question. Great question, though. What else? Yes, sir.
You mentioned the Bill of Rights twice in passing.
Yeah.
The Charters of Freedom, the 3 documents
Yeah.
that are permanently on display, the Bill of Rights is there instead of the Gettysburg Address.
Yeah.
In part, I presume, because the Gettysburg Address is too fragile to actually show that way. But did the Bill of Rights get the same treatment as the Constitution and the Declaration during the 1942?
Yeah, so let me answer the question this way. First of all, I will argue that the Gettysburg Address is not enshrined because it's not engrossed. You know what I'm saying? So it's a manuscript copy. So that's one of my, I kind of wish it was engrossed so it got that kind of play. No, the Bill of Rights is here at the archives. It comes, I want to say, around 38. I may be a little bit off on the year. From about 1814, during the Stephen Pleasanton time, even though the Bill of Rights is not specifically mentioned in his hiding place when he takes it out to Virginia, the suspicion is that that was part of what he took out. But there's not much known about the Bill of Rights between that time and that 1938 time when it comes to the archives. The archives during the Second World War was also known as Fort Archives. Why? It's considered one of the buildings that would be able to resist some bombings. So it stays here. It's not part of that movement out to Fort Knox. So great question. But yes, It's part of the, and I kind of include it, even though it's a separate parchment, separate document, I include it when I talk about it, and even in the book to some extent, as part of the Constitution, as the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Even though, again, they almost don't happen. I mean, Madison, who's the father, quote unquote, of the Bill of Rights, was one of the great objectors to the Bill of Rights during the Constitutional Convention. So why does he change his mind when the first Congress is elected? He changes his mind because there's lots of concern from people like George Mason, from people like Monroe. There's concern that they're not going to go along with this, that they're going to call for a second convention. Unless this Bill of Rights gets included, they're going to call for a second convention and maybe blow up the whole Constitution. So Madison, and the credit goes to him here, promises that when he's elected to the first Congress, he will fight for a Bill of Rights, and he does. So that's how that kind of all, nice question, yes?
The material that was left Washington left it under very heavy guard. When particularly the second through whatever tier.
Second through 6 tiers.
Thank you.
Yes.
When those things were deposited in Washington and Lee, UVA, and
Yep,
Dickinson, what sort of safeguard measures
Yeah. So
were?
I will tell you this, a great question. Did you all hear the question? What kind of safeguards? So they go out on tractor-trailer trucks. They go out in trucks. So there's lots of safeguards kind of as they're being packed. There's sometimes a vehicle that accompanies them, but not a huge, there's no huge like procession. It's done almost anonymously, if you will. So trucks would go out. In fact, some of the boxes say Library of Congress on the side.
Steal me, yeah.
Yes, yes. Well, and so one of the things McLeish makes a big deal of afterwards is that how so many different groups of people kept this a secret.
But once the things were stored
Yes.
in these repositories, what sort of
Yes.
measures were made to safeguard them
Right,
there?
they were guarded 24/7 by the Library of Congress, which set up guards there. Library of Congress personnel visited those repositories several times to make sure things are okay with leaks and humidity and
Right.
mites and vermin and all of the above, yeah.
When those materials were returned to Washington,
Yep.
were they re-inventoried to make sure everything was still there?
Yes, yes, and they were re-inventoried to make sure everything was still there. And one of the great mysteries to this day, I touch on it on the book, but probably more should be done, is that among the things missing were 2 Walt Whitman notebooks, right?
Butterfly, yeah.
Yeah, so one of them turned up a little bit later, there's still one missing, yeah. But amazingly, no, everything comes back intact. The whole thing is done in secret.
Remarkable.
It's stunning, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes,
I know.
thank you.
Thank you. We have time for one more. Oh, yes, sir.
First of all, my condolences about the socks.
Listen, I didn't have a good feeling going in.
I know, I didn't either. I wanted to underscore one thing you said, and that gentleman observes, by way of an anecdote. I'm one of those tour guides who takes 8th graders through the court.
Great.
And it was an 8th grader from New Jersey, a young lady who came up to me, again in the hushed rotunda, and said, "There's a man over there taking pictures," which of course is not permitted. And I said, "Really, where?" And sure enough, there was a person rather surreptitiously down about waist level. And so I said, "You're right, you have to tell the guards." And she said, but he's wearing a suit. And I explained that biggest crooks in the world wear suits. And said, "You have to tell." And she went over, and she did. And actually, she and another girl. And the guard went over, took the man's camera, looked through it. I presumably deleted the things and chatted with him. I don't know what they said. But afterwards, we're getting on the bus on 9th Street, and her hand comes up at the back of the bus. And she said with obvious pride and appropriate meaning that she realized that they had just defended the Constitution.
Ooh, that's really good.
Yeah.
What a way to end it. Guys, I'll be signing up back. If you come up and buy a book, great. If you don't choose to buy a book, please, if you haven't been in the Rotunda today, go. Go. Thank you very much.